Good morning and good afternoon. This is Monica Paolini from Senza Fili. And today I'm going to talk to Nanda Menon, the Director of Corporate Development at Athonet, and about MulteFire. This is in part of a series of interviews and conversations about the role of MulteFire in the enterprise. Nanda, thanks for being with us today.
Hello, Monica. I'm pleased to be here.
Excellent. So to get started, can you tell us what is that you do? What is that Athonet is doing in this area?
Sure, delighted. So Athonet is unique in the telecoms industry because we are the only industrial LTE solution that's built by industry for industry. And why do I say that? Whereas you look at most LTE solutions or enterprise LTE solutions or private LTE solutions that are in the marketplace today, they are really solutions made by vendors to the telecoms industry, to the large telecoms players who've repurposed that kit, which is designed for the large telcos to serve the enterprise. What makes us different is that from our very earliest days, beginning in 2005, when we started to our first deployment, which was for NL, doing the world's first LTE smart grid, even before the commercial networks were perhaps launched in Europe. In 2011, we did this for NL, the world's first smart grid. We then followed that very quickly with public safety. And we are also an investee company of NL. And over the last 7 years, in close collaboration with NL, who's one of the largest utilities in Europe with over 70 billion in revenues, we really built a product that is unique and designed for the use of industry verticals rather than telcos. And why is that important? Because industry verticals want an IT product. They don't have hundreds of telecoms engineers running around who can manage complex, CLI-based issues. What they want is a mobile LTE solution that's very simple to manage, simple to deploy. They're used to products like Wi-Fi, and they want an LTE product that is as simple and cheap and affordable and quick to deploy, simple to deploy, and an IT product that they're used to.
Absolutely, and that's very interesting to talk about, because and this is what we want to talk about, is what is different for the enterprise in terms of what different technologies, solutions. So it's not just the basic technologies are the same, but the way you deploy to them, the way they use them is different. And so I think let's try to talk a little bit about that and talk about the work you've been doing with Enel and being Italian and growing up with them as the electricity provider. We used to pronounce it Enel, not it's interesting. But anyway, what is that you've been doing with them, and how did you get around to develop a solution specifically for them? Or obviously the others in the enterprise space.
Right, so I'll begin with NL, but also talk about some of the other deployments we're doing, because we have about 100 deployments now.
Yeah. We can talk about it. Just a quick introduction, just for context, and then we're going to talk about all the other ones.
Sure. So when we first started in 2011, the problem that NL was trying to solve was the low latency that they needed for electricity switching and distribution in their substations, which is spread across the countryside. And as you move towards the digital utility and you're running SCADA systems, you need latency that is as low as 10, 11, 12, 15, 20 milliseconds. And not only do you need it at those levels, you need it in a very reliable way. It needs to be predictive. It needs to be deterministic. It can't jitter all over the place. And that's something that first of all is impossible to guarantee in a commercial LTE network. And if you think about putting out a solution like fiber, it may work in certain areas which are in dense cosmopolitan areas or where there's already a fiber footprint. But when you try and cover 40,000 substations across a good-sized country in Europe, it becomes prohibitive. So you need a wireless solution. The macro network from the operator can't give you that kind of reliability and predictability. A Wi-Fi network simply can't give you the coverage. And again, the jitter and the reliability don't suit that purpose. So you needed the reliability that LTE brings and the functionality that LTE brings to be able to do that, to prioritize traffic, and to be able to guarantee that this equipment will work. Because remember, many of these things, it's not just, the problem if you don't have the low latency and if the latency spikes is that you can cause the entire system to go into shutdown, especially if there's because they monitor things with this very low latency. And if there is a fault, the network, in order to protect itself, will shut itself down.
So how does MulteFire help here?
So one of the biggest challenges that enterprises have had up to now when they've tried to deploy a network is the fact that they need to be reliant on regulators or a mobile operator in order to have spectrum. Mobile operators themselves run very successful businesses. Their spectrum usage can be very congested, and it can be quite difficult for the enterprise to get spectrum. Even when the mobile operator wants to help out, sometimes it's simply not possible because you have issues of coverage, you have issues of interference with existing networks. And so from an enterprise perspective, they would like to have a channel that they know that they can deploy these private LTE networks on in a predictable way without having to go and apply for spectrum each time. And you can imagine if you're dealing with a large enterprise, you talked about the issue that NL faces. I mean, NL operates in 34 countries across the world. For someone who's not a telco and for whom being a telecoms company is not a core business, dealing with 34 regulators, 34 telecoms operators in 34 different countries and 34 different jurisdictions speaking 34 different languages is simply not a practical thing for them to do. So the beauty about something like MulteFire is you can have a solution that works everywhere across the world in every market without having to deal with the complexities of having to negotiate with every single telco and every single regulator in every jurisdiction that you want to deploy.
Absolutely, and then, but it still can use the technology, the ecosystem of LTE. So that's obviously an advantage. Exactly. It's not a proprietary solution.
Exactly, and the interoperability that you have between different vendors in LTE, of course, is quite important because you don't have the same degree of interoperability when it comes to enterprise Wi-Fi.
Right, and so, but what about using enterprise Wi-Fi? Is that how does it relate to it?
So I'll give you a concrete example. So immediately after we did the project for NL on the substations, the next thing that we did was to try and cover a power plant for them, which is one of the largest power plants in Europe, the Vittoria 2 power plant. It's about 2 square kilometers, quite a complex radio environment because it's a coal-fired power plant. There's a big boiler room. It's 2,000 megawatts. A lot of steel around the boiler and the functional areas. You've got very large domes of coal, which are spread across the 2-kilometer area. You've got trains, cargo trains coming in and out, bringing the coal. So lots of movement of metal, domes of coal, which again create areas of blockage. So it became a very complex area to try and cover. They tried Wi-Fi and simply found that it didn't meet the requirements. And you can imagine the number of Wi-Fi access points that were needed, the amount of cabling that's needed. It turned out to be quite an expensive enterprise as well to carry out, quite an expensive project. But that was something that we were able to cover with simply one macro base station. And it covered the whole plant, gave true mobility, was able to deal with the changing radio environments, with the coal domes, with the trains coming in and out. And not only that, we were able to get very good coverage inside the boiler room and even going one floor beneath. So it was very apparent to everybody the superiority of LTE. Now, of course, when you work in MulteFire, you can't project at the same power that you're able to do on licensed spectrum, it will be lower, but the coverage that you get from MulteFire is at the same power output as Wi-Fi, tends to be 3 to 4 times better in terms of coverage, but you also get much better throughput and much better reliability, and also the ability to deal with large numbers of simultaneous users with high bandwidth, particularly when you're using video surveillance, thermal cameras, thermal imaging, man down. You've got workers with head cams on them, or as we are now finding in mines with autonomous vehicles and mining machinery. This is something that Wi-Fi really wasn't designed to handle.
So basically, when you have this kind of MulteFire deployment in enterprise like Eno, and it gives you better coverage and capacity. So it's for all sorts of applications. It's not just obviously data. So it's data connectivity, but also all specific IoT applications, as you mentioned, right?
Correct. But one thing that is also very important, which enterprises are increasingly beginning to focus on, is also the security aspect, because the security levels that you find in LTE are much higher, very different level from what you find in Wi-Fi. You very commonly hear of Wi-Fi systems getting hacked, whereas it's very rare. In fact, I'm not aware of any LTE network being hacked. So the security is becoming increasingly a very big aspect to this. I know as technologists, we can always get very excited about throughputs and all the wonderful things that you can do with LTE, but actually it can be something just as basic as very high levels of security, which is also a motivator for enterprises to adopt LTE.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about all the different countries. So like Anel, you said, I think 34 countries where they operate. Do you see any difference in terms of what the requirements are, what they're trying to do in different countries? So
the regulatory framework for LTE is very similar to Wi-Fi. So the availability of LTE and the ease of deployment of LTE in different jurisdictions will be the same as Wi-Fi. So to the extent that Wi-Fi is universally available, we don't expect MulteFire to be any different.
Okay, so that's good. So there's some sort of a commonality there. So you don't need to go and, for instance, use a different band, or which you do if you use.
It operates on the same band.
Yeah.
Same.
So it's more easily deployable across different geographies. Now, from an enterprise point of view, one question they might ask you is like, we know Wi-Fi, we just put access points, we're done. MulteFire, it's LTE. What is it we need to do differently? What is it we need to do from an enterprise point of view to get it going?
So in order for enterprise LTE to be a success, we need to replicate exactly what you just described. With LTE, with Wi-Fi, they put up a few access points and they're done. And that's exactly what we need to do with LTE as well. And I think that's where when you started off and you said, what is it that's different about the enterprise, and you asked us what makes it different, it's that simplicity of deployment that enterprise LTE brings, and what we focused on over the years, to be able to have a core network, to be able to have access points that you simply plug in plug into an Ethernet connection, connecting back to the core network. And as far as the enterprise is concerned, that's all they do. It's exactly like plugging in a Wi-Fi network. Why does the enterprise need to care whether it's LTE or Wi-Fi? All they need to know is you have an access point, put it up, plug it into the Ethernet port, and you've got a private network.
Yeah. So they don't have to deal. They don't have to. Yeah, they don't have to deal about the. So in a licensed LTE, you have a core. It's a complex infrastructure that you need behind the access point. And MulteFire, how does MulteFire deal with that?
So it all comes down to the core network. The radio part of it is laid out at the enterprise. If you've been to any of the, if you been to any of our MulteFire demos and coming to Mobile World Congress this year, please stop by to the MulteFire booth or to our booth, and you'll be able to see how simple these deployments actually are. I mean, it literally is as simple as deploying Wi-Fi. You put your access point up, plug it into your intranet, and it connects back to the core network. The core network is something that is transparent to the enterprise. All they see is a little GUI, which shows them the users. You literally click on it, enable the user, set whatever priorities you want for the user, set whatever requirements you have specifically for that user in terms of throughput, in terms of the kinds of services that he wants, whether you want to connect it to whichever platform you want, whether it's Azure or AWS for your IoT platforms, or a third party, or your own. It's all designed to literally be click and deploy and click to action. And that is a difference between a telecoms grade, a telecoms type of core network complexity and the enterprise ease of use that we're trying to bring in MulteFire.
Absolutely. So yeah, we're trying to combine the carrier grade in terms of quality, but then the easy of management. Now, let's talk a bit about other experiences you have with other clients. Are they in the developed markets, emerging markets, both? Do you see any difference there, or anything that you think it's particularly relevant here?
So in the early days, a lot of our deployments, whether they are in public safety or in enterprise, have tended to be in developed markets in the early days. What we're seeing this year is a bit more sort of deployment into emerging markets. I'd say that when we look at some of the verticals that we're very active in, after the success that we've had at NL, it's attracted the attention of the mining sector. And that's another very important vertical for us, where we're deployed in a number of mines. And we're seeing quite a lot of interest from mines in emerging markets as well. And as we begin to do that, we actually see that besides the mine itself, there's an opportunity for the mine to serve the surrounding areas, doing corporate social responsibility, because the availability of broadband of any kind in many emerging markets and developing markets is simply not available. So all of a sudden, when you start looking at MulteFire and say, what can that mean in terms of bringing coverage to the unconnected, in terms of connecting the unconnected and bridging the digital divide, all of a sudden, what it does is that it opens up this prospect of community-based LTE. Where even in the most deprived of environments, in the least developed countries in the world, it becomes very simple for someone, in the same way that we set these networks up in enterprise, to be able to put up a couple of radios, connected back with some to a local core or a remote core using a satellite or any kind of backhaul, or even a standalone network when there is no backhaul. So if you look in many countries, they've been spending a lot of money trying to roll out Wi-Fi to bring in connectivity in areas where populations have been remote and don't have coverage. Many developing countries have been trying this, and what they're actually finding is that Wi-Fi is actually quite difficult to roll out in that manner, because it wasn't designed to do that. LTE, however, was designed to solve exactly this problem. And when you take away the cost of spectrum and you make it self-deployable, because that's really what we focused on, self-deployable networks, and all of a sudden a small community can literally, for a few tens of thousands, put up a network which can serve 1,000, 2,000 people. So you can actually have a network where you can have Wi-Fi and LTE coexisting, where you can use LTE to give you macro coverage or medium area coverage, and then use Wi-Fi and MiFi as capillary networks inside a building or inside a small town or inside a slum dwelling in order to give regional coverage. So we think that MulteFire can actually accelerate the growth of Wi-Fi. So we actually see in developing markets these as two complementary devices, because one of the great things that Wi-Fi has is there are lots of devices out there already which have Wi-Fi compatible terminals, Wi-Fi compatible devices. But the problem it has always has been acting as a central point, a focal point for bringing in all of that capillarity, which LTE can do. So if you can combine MulteFire CPEs with MiFi, it's almost a perfect situation for emerging markets.
Absolutely, and that could also be coupled with all the enterprise deployments. So once you have the whole sort of local ecosystem, and you basically can give these communities a chance to almost leapfrog compared to some of the developed markets where you might have more of a legacy solution, because you start afresh, so you don't have to. Now, you mentioned the mining sector. Can you give us a few examples of applications there where MulteFire is particularly strong?
So one of the great advantages when you go into the mining sector, and particularly when you go underground, is that you're effectively in your own private environment. So there's no interference. There's no risk of leakage. You have full control over who comes in, who goes out, what devices people can take in. So it is almost like being in a completely licensed environment. And that's the beauty of deploying it underground. Today, there are many LTE applications that we use underground, but the challenge always is in jurisdictional. There are some jurisdictions where you can deploy LTE underground without having to go back to a mobile operator or a regulator. But there are other jurisdictions where even if you're underground, you need to work with a mobile operator or you need to work with a regulator. What MulteFire does is to allow mines to deploy these networks underground or overground in their case. Again, they tend to be in quite remote areas, so they have almost a private environment. So the typical kinds of activities that we're seeing in mining, asset tracking, human tracking, control of autonomous mining machinery. But if you were to ask me for an application, my favorite application, is something called LTE blasting. This is using LTE to explode dynamite, what LTE allows you to do before you actually explode the dynamite is to track the assets, track the people, make sure that no one's in the area, be able to have pre-programmed sort of algorithms or sequences that you can put together to make sure that an area is clear, health and safety, go through all of that checks, culminating in the explosive act. As someone who grew up enjoying fireworks, I think LTE blasting is definitely my favorite application.
That is a cool one, and also it's also interesting because you have to combine very different sort of sub applications, human tracking, asset tracking, and put all that information together. So that's an interesting one. Now let me ask you, in terms of roadmap, how do you see that as sort of the timeline for adoption?
In terms of MulteFire or looking?
MulteFire in general, in general for the enterprise over the next.
Sure. So I think one of the great things that has happened this year was we had the first MulteFire infrastructure solutions. So we had the first radios that came out at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona earlier this year, and I think there have been one or two other manufacturers have come out with it over the year. I think what's happening now is the next stage would be to start seeing devices, handsets, CPEs in particular, because I'm a big believer that Wi-Fi and MulteFire can actually coexist. So I think what we'd like to see are CPEs and MiFi type of devices first, so that we can harness the strength of MulteFire and harness the strength of Wi-Fi as well. So that I think is the big development that I'm looking for in 2019. I think at the same time, we're also looking at what's happening in CBRS, because that's going to be one of the first deployments of lightly licensed spectrum, which is similar to what we're trying to do in MulteFire. And I think that's going to generate people's interest and show people the use cases and generate interest from the wider world in terms of saying, hey, if this is happening in the US, we want to have it as well. And that's going to help the ecosystem as well. We're seeing in Japan, of course, already MulteFire is available today on 1.9 gigahertz. So that's the first MulteFire market, and we're quite involved in that already. And so that's going to be another market that's going to that is developing and where the CPEs are coming out. So I think a combination of what's happening in CBRS in the US and what's happening with MulteFire in Japan, I think in over 2019 is going to start other countries saying, you know what, we actually see the sense of this, and there's demand from enterprises, and especially when you move towards emerging markets and many other places where there isn't broadband, people are going to say that, hey, this is a real alternative. I'm very excited about what 2019 holds for MulteFire.
Absolutely, that sounds excellent. And Nanda, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us and let us know what LTE blasting is. That's really cool stuff.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for listening in this conversation.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye.
Arrivederci.